All right, guys, and welcome to the Math 3 lesson for today. We're going to be talking about absolute value functions. The first question asks us in question number 1, it says if x is greater than or equal to 0, then we want to make y equals x. And if you think about y equals x, it's just going to be a straight line diagonal. So if we write y equals x in our calculator, that's what it'll look at like in y equals negative x. But remember, we're talking about when x is greater than 0, and then when x is less than 0, it's y equals negative x. So this is the y equals negative x line. It's the slope of negative 1. This is the y equals x line, which is a slope of positive 1. And these make a v, which is what we're going to be talking about today for absolute value. You do need a graphing calculator today to follow along. So if you have a graphing calculator, this will be great. If you don't, Walmart or Amazon is a possibility to get one like this. If you do not have, they'll last you all the way through college for sure. If you're not able to do so, there is an app on iPhones and Apple devices called Calculate 84, and it's free, and it will look just like the calculator, or you can try and use Desmos as well as we go through. Okay, so on the calculator, it wants us to graph the absolute value of x. So y equals the absolute value of x. So I'm going to show you how we do that. So we go to y equals on our graph. We make sure everything's cleared out. We're going to go to math. So the math button is right here below the green, over to num and abs. And we're going to type in x and then hit the right arrow. That just puts the x in the absolute value bars. So that's y equals the absolute value of x. And there is our graph. So y equals the absolute value of x is a graph of v. It stops right there at the origin, and it looks just like what we created with negative x and positive x. So now we're going to answer some questions based on the graph. So compare the graph I just showed you on the calculator that we made to graph number 1. It's the same graph, right? It's the exact same graph. What is the shape of the graph? The graph of an absolute value graph is a V shape, so it makes a V. What is the slope of the two lines? Well, we already talked about that. The one going to the left, the slope of it is negative 1, and the other one going to the right, the slope of it is positive 1. What is the vertex of the graph? The vertex is where it hits the middle point right there, the bottom. So the vertex is 0, 0. What is the domain and range? So the domain is all the way to the left and all the way to the right. So if you look at the domain of an absolute value graph, it's going to continue all the way to the left and all the way to the right. So that means it goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. And then the range is going to stop here at 0. It doesn't go any lower, and it goes up to positive infinity. So our range is from 0 to positive infinity. What is the axis of symmetry? If we make a line straight down our graph, that's how we get the axis of symmetry. Axis stands for what the x will be. So the axis of symmetry is at x equals 0. Remember, this is our x axis, and it goes right down the middle. We make a line right down the middle, and it would be at x equals 0. If I was over here, I'd be at like x equals 1 or x equals 2 or x equals negative 1. But this graph, the middle of it is at x equals 0. So that's our axis of symmetry. You can think of your axis of symmetry as like what cuts the graph just right in half. Okay, so let's go to the bottom. Number 3, if we type in y equals the absolute value of x and then subtract 4, so let me show you how you would do that on your graph. Just like we had y equals the absolute value of x. Now on the outside, if we put minus 4 and then hit graph, it's going to move that graph down 4. If we look at this next equation, if we hit absolute value of x and then say plus 2, it's going to move that graph up 2. So we can see what happens when we add or subtract a number to the outside of the absolute value bars. If you subtract, it is going to move the graph down. And if you add, it's going to move the graph up. So that answers the questions down here. What happens when you subtract a number from the function? You will move the graph down. What happens when you add a number to the function? It will move the graph up. So let's go to page 2, and we want to look at what happens when we add or subtract inside of the absolute value bars. So we're going to go to math num abs. We're going to say x minus 4 inside of the absolute value bars, and we're going to hit graph, and we can see what happens there. That moves it to the right by 4. So x minus 4 inside of the absolute value bars, if we subtract, we are moving to the right. If we add, let's see what happens. So if we go x plus 2 inside of the absolute value bars, we are moving to the left. So you can see there, if you subtract inside the absolute value bars, it moves the graph to the right. You still have that same V shape. If you add 2 inside of the absolute value bars, you move the graph left 2. Still got the same V shape. So that answers our next 2 questions. What happens when you subtract a number inside of the function, so inside of the bars? It moves to the right. What happens when you add a number inside of the function? It moves to the left. So we go down to number 11. What happens if we put a negative out in front of the absolute value bars? So we say negative math num abs. We put an x there. We graph it, and it has flipped it upside down. So we still have that V shape, but it is flipped upside down. So what happens when you do that? It flips the graph. And now we're going to look at some fractions. So let me show you some fractions. If you put a 2 out in front, it makes the slope of this 2. So it makes your graph more narrow. Closer to the y-axis. It makes the slope, it makes it steeper. If you take 5 halves, that's 2.5. It makes it even steeper than it was before. Number 15, if you have a slope of 1/2, that means you're going up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2, up 1 over 2, and so on. Then you see a much wider graph. And then if you go to 2/5, that's like 0.4, it would be even wider than that. So the number out in front is your slope, which is going to determine how wide or how narrow your graph is in these questions. So we're going to go to this last page, and those questions at the top we just answered. So what happens to the graph when the function is multiplied by a number greater than 1? It's going to make it steeper. It's going to be more narrow. It's going to get close to the y-axis. What happens to the graph when it is multiplied by a number between 0 and 1? So that means a fraction, a small number. It's going to get wider, and it's going to be closer to that x-axis, right? It's going to be a lot wider. The slope is going to be smaller there. These graphs are in the form AF of x, which means A is that number out in front. So what does the A represent? That A represents the slope. So now we look at some questions for this. How would we write an equation if we want to shift it down 4 units? That would be y equals the absolute value of x and then minus 4 on the outside. That's how we would move it down 4. If we want to move it left 6 units, then we would go inside of the absolute value bars, because remember, if you're going left or right, you want to go inside. So we would do x plus 6, because we're going to shift it left 6. So we're inside of the absolute value bars, and we add 6. If we want to shift it right 2 and up 1, we got to go inside of the absolute value bars and subtract 2. That gets us right 2. Then we go outside of the absolute value bars and add 1. That gets us up 1. Then if we want to flip it upside down, then we put a negative out in front and then shift it left 5. We have the absolute value of x plus 5. Okay, so again, anytime you need to check, if you think maybe you didn't do this correctly or maybe something was wrong, type this into your calculator and see if it matches up with what the description is saying. So down here, we want to see what's happened, describe what's happened. If we have y equals the absolute value of x and minus 5 on the outside, what we've done is we've moved down 5. If we have a 5 out in front and then the absolute value of x plus 7, what we've done is made our graph have a slope of 5, so we've made it a lot steeper. Slope is now 5, and we've moved it to the left 7. If we have a negative out in front, a slope of 1/4, and then just the absolute value of x, the negative has flipped our graph. The slope of 1/4 has made it wider, right? So a slope of 1/4, that makes it wider. In 27, what we've done is we have subtract 4 inside and added 3 outside. If you subtract inside of the function, you move it right. So we moved it right 4, and then adding 3 moves it up 3. So that answers your questions there. So now we get to graphing this function, and it is 2 absolute value of x minus 1 and then minus 3. So 2 math num abs x minus 1, and then outside of the absolute value bars we're going to put minus 3, and we're going to graph. So you can see that we have an absolute value function that I've graphed over here with a slope of 2. It has moved to the right 1, and it has moved down 3. And that's where you can see our new graph. So then we want to answer a couple questions about this new graph. What is the shape of it? It's a V shape, just like any absolute value function. What is the vertex of the graph, and how do you know? The vertex is that bottom point, that minimum point there. How you know is you can actually look at the equation. It's moved right 1 and it's moved down 3. So if I move right 1 from 0, I'm at positive 1. And if I move down 3 from 0, I'm at negative 3. This point here is positive 1, negative 3. Does it open up or down? And how do you know? It opens up because we have a positive slope here. We have a positive number in front of absolute value. If we would have had a negative, it would flip it and it would open down. What are the slopes of the two lines that create the graph? That comes from the number in front, right? So the slope of 2 means you go up 2, and this one means you go up negative 2. What is the domain and range? So the domain of absolute value equations is always all real numbers, because it's always going to go all the way to the left and all the way to the right. So the domain always goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. The range goes from your lowest number. So the range goes from your lowest number, the lowest you go, that's negative 3, to the highest you would go. And you see these continue all the way to infinity. So our range is from negative 3, the lowest, all the way up to infinity. The axis of symmetry is what splits the graph in half. It's always going to be x equals, and it's where the graph gets split in half. So it's right down the middle. And that would be at x equals 1. So the axis of symmetry is that number that's in your vertex, if you want to think of it that way. It splits that graph in half where you could just fold it right over each other, and that is x equals 1. So today you've looked at absolute value graphs. You've looked at how to graph them in the calculator. You've looked at the transformations, left, right, up, down, the slope when it's flipped, and then you've also taken a look at the domain, the range, and the axis of symmetry. And that is all we have for today. So if you'll complete these, and then the problems will go from there. The problems you're assigned will come from these types of questions. Thank you, and have a great day.